15.
Thank you. Elena, when you say she's Chinese, I always get a bit kind of nervous because yes, I am Chinese by birth, but British by law, European by spirit, so. Okay. I got lots of pictures, so you might need to lower down the light on me, but yeah, so we can see a bit. So I'm supposed to be here talking about the stories of my life, but I hope it's not only about me, because I hope you will learn something about China 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s, and also the life of an immigrant. I think really, essentially, I'm an immigrant, which apply to lots of people in London and in Europe and in the West. We're all immigrant nowadays. So now, all these things I will mention, of course, in this book, but I'm supposed to visualize all these things within 15 minutes with some photos. And if you want to know more, of course, it's in the book. So this is a fishing village where I was born and I grew up. It's a fishing village called Shitang. It's south of Shanghai by the East China Sea. And you can see in the background the Chinese characters on the roof of those houses, and it says "Da Dao Mei Di," meaning down with American imperialism. So, especially now, we need to use that again, maybe. So this is a fishing village I lived the first 7 years with my grandparents, and of course, it really fed into me, most of my books, most of my films, my inspiration, my depression, and also kind of inspirations really based on this village, because it was a very brutal village. Most of the people walking around in the street are widows. So it's in my young eyes, it's a village of death, or the island of death. And actually it was a peninsula, but somehow I always thought it's an island, because when I was young, I felt it's a place always surrounded by the sea. And I felt this isolation by the massive sea around me without meeting my parents. I'll tell you the story later. Now, this is the fishing village my father drew and painted later on in the 1980s. And my father somehow sees this fishing village as island, but not as peninsula. Because in China, our coastline is very long, and most of the village, if you're a fishing village, you're not on an island, because most of the islands are military-based, communist-controlled military village. So my village was peninsula, but in my father's eyes, he was a painter, and he always painted the village as a little island. And you see in the background, in the front, there's a fishing boat, there's a boat return to the village. Many years later, I saw this picture. I think you are more familiar with this famous painting than me, by this Swiss symbolist artist, Berkling. And I think he painted 100 years ago, called The Eye of the Dead. So some years ago, I was in the National Gallery, and then I saw this painting. I said, I saw this painting before. I knew this place. Where was it? Where is this place? And someone said, well, it's in Italy. A painter painted 100 years ago. And then suddenly I remember all these island pictures my father drew and painted. And then my father painted all the picture of my fishing village as a little island, the island of death, and very dark, many, many versions. And then later on, I learned that this artist also drew the many different versions of that little island, which is somewhere near Italy, somewhere, religious background. Anyway, so it reminds me of my early years. And next one, I didn't draw this. I had to use my 4-year-old daughter's hand to draw this, to imitate a 4-year-old me when I was young in this fishing village. So I had to use one of her drawings, actually from yesterday. This was an octopus, not octopus, actually, it's a little jellyfish, because she thought it's octopus. So when I was young, so I was born during the Cultural Revolution, 1973, and the Cultural Revolution ended in 1976. But still, from the 80s and the 90s, still the collective farming, the collective industrial fishing still very strong. So when I was young, I think in the early 80s or the end of 70s, the kids were looking for dead fish on the beach. And all the dead fish, the big ones, already been picked up by the adults because we were starving, hunger for food. And as a young kid, I remember every day I was walking on the beach, looking for the dead jellyfish, because we pickle the jellyfish in the ginger sauce with vinegar. So every morning you will have a very big porridge with salted jellyfish. It sounds exotic, but it's very yucky. So, and I remember I hated that taste. I remember all of my childhood, I hated that kind of style of the food. When I came to Britain, I refused to eat porridge until 5 years ago I started. And I think I wanted to also talk about as a Chinese writer, our relationship to the writing is really very much based on the characters. When I say character, meaning ideogram, the Chinese actual writing. And I think this is very important for me, and I think for any writers from Far East culture, switch their language like me. Now I write in English, my second language. A language I couldn't master and I still can't master, and I felt, my lifelong struggle is with the second language I'm writing. Anyway, so this is the language I began as a little, young, whatever you call it, young poet, young writer. It's an ideogram. So the Chinese characters based on the picture of the object. So here you can see the fire, the first one is fire. So the fire, then in the beginning of our calligraph, you draw fire. And then later on, the third one is something like, in the Ming Dynasty, we regulate a bit of calligraph. So the calligraph is less so complex. And the last one here, so this one, so it's more like standardized. You can use that kind of typing in the computer. It will come out less so like picture, because the standardization is to make everything much more even. So less personal kind of calligraph style based. Second letter, tree, 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 tree. So the modern days, we write the last letter on the computer or in the notebook. And the third one, mountain, 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 mountain. So these are the kind of evolution of our writing system. And still, calligraph is one of the most important things in Chinese art, to value if you are good or not. If you're a good artist, you should have a good calligraph. But now we all use computer in China. So that is the tradition I came from. And for me, if you're a good writer, you're good with your calligraph. You're good with writing words. And that is very difficult, I think, for me later on, 15 years later, when I came to Britain. When I switched writing English, I found totally lost, not only because of the language, the difficulty of the language, but also the meaning, the picture is missing in my adopted language. So I wanted you to understand, some literature from perhaps different backgrounds. Okay, this is my father. I think the picture was taken 1980s. So he was supposed to be a peasant, like most of the Chinese in the 70s, 80s. 90% of Chinese in the 70s were peasant. And so he was supposed to be a fisherman, because my family, my grandparents, they were fishermen. The fishermen, so in Chinese ID card, we only have two categories: peasants household or citizen household. you are not allowed to move from job to job, because that were breaking the registration system, which continued in China for thousands of years. And in the communism time, the government simply adopted that system. So nothing new with the new government, after Mao, until now, we are bound, we are wedded to our ID card system, So the only way to change from peasant ID card to citizen ID card is you go to the city, become university student. Then you acquire the certificate or the degree, then you change your life. So my father really influenced me, I think, from a kind of peasant girl inspired to become a writer, and he was a painter. And he was in the camp, in Cultural Revolution camp, for more than 15 years, from 60s and then 70s. And before 1960s, before the Cultural Revolution started, in China, in the 50s, we have anti-right-wing movement. So all the educated people went to prison. And I think my father went into one of the camp in my province in 1957. So he was a father always, in the labor camp. And when I met my father was much later, when I was 7 or 8, when he was totally recovered from his kind of ruined political reputation, because the government decided, okay, most of the people were innocent. So that he came back, and he was assigned an official job as a state artist, state painter. So he given this big studio, he has to paint all the propaganda posters. So when I was young, I was watching him painting all the propaganda stuff. So I'm very familiar with the idea of a state artist, unlike, some newspaper in the West say, what, state artist? I said that they are amazing people. I know them, and they are wonderful with their hands. So I know the other way around too, being not a state artist, which is me. And this is my mother. Of course, she doesn't look normal here because she was on the stage. So in the daytime, she was working in this very big silk factory in my hometown. And at nighttime, she was one of those, kind of amateur worker actors in one of those revolutionary operas invented by Chairman Mao's wife, Madame Mao. So I remember when I was 8 or 9 or 10 years old, she was singing those revolutionary songs, at home, in praise of Mao and all that. So that was the continuation of the Cultural Revolution. And in China, from 60s, 70s, there's 8 big revolutionary operas you are allowed to perform. Because it is invented by Mao's wife. So everything else is banned. You can perform these 8 revolutionary operas. And my mother was in those operas, and I was watching. I think this continued until 90s, this fashion. Now, I wanted to mention this book very quickly because for me, the whole journey to the West, to become a writer not under the regime, under the suppression of political language, is very much to do with Beat generation. And Allen Ginsberg was free in China in the 1980s, as well as many other Western writers, the French literature, American literature, English literature was eventually being introduced and passed the censorship in the 80s and 90s. And this is one of the very important books I read in Chinese translation. And I loved it, and I became a young poet in the end of 1980s and then 90s. So I do feel very important, his stuff. And this is me, went to Beijing in 1993 when I was 19 and a half, studied cinema in Beijing Film Academy. So I was a little revolutionary kid, very angry and sad. So in the 90s, very important in Beijing, what's going on in China is those naked body artists running around. They were underground, they were censored by the state. But that was the beginning of the modern art of Chinese movement, Chinese modern art movement from 90s. It started from those nude artists on the Great Wall. And you could see, you know, there's a Great Walls. And always the performance will be on the Great Wall because this is a place the police barely go there, you know, it's so high up, far away. And I went all these places and I wrote about those underground art in this book. And of course, I think I was kind of very much, you know, hoping I would be one of them, but I didn't, of course. And then I came to Europe, and I used, you know, 17th century map, because it matched my imagination and the reality. Europe is so old. I had to use this old map. So I left China with a scholarship 15 years ago, came to Britain, studied film. And then I think the first 10 years, I had a quite hard time. I think linguistically, culturally, and also just simply as an immigrant, I couldn't get my visa legalized for all sorts of reasons. And from that moment, after I've left China 15 years ago, I realized if I want to have a cultural dignity, not only live as an immigrant, I have to continue to write as a writer and continue to make film as an artist. And therefore, I pick up the second language, and I wrote those books. I just put some photos there, but don't take too serious. And one of the films I would never make if I didn't leave China, not Xiaolu Guo's film, but my own film, Chinese, because I think this film was important for me. I made about like 10 films, fiction, documentary, essays, but this one film, I think, for me is very important because in China, we watched the Xiaolu Guo films he made in the 1960s called Le Chinoise. It's about all European left-wing communists looking to the East, you know, homage to the East revolution. But revolution in our mind, meaning parents in prison, meaning ideological control and purge. So for me, it's important to pay a homage to Xiaolu Guo to make my version of La Chinoise. So I made Chinese, and it's a reverse journey of a Chinese girl leaving village, leaving the communist system, come to the West. Of course, it's a very critical version of his film and my own life too. And that's the end of the talk. Whatever is said doesn't take too serious, but you can read. And I hope my journey is, you know, indeed I think it's an immigrant journey, but also the struggle to be an artist, not only in the East or not only in the West, but an artist can talk to anyone around my everyday life. The last thing I want to mention is this book. If you ever have to painfully read a Chinese classic book, then choose this one because they're all very painful to read, so don't bother. My book is not classical, it's very easy to read. But anyway, so this book, I think, really inspired my journey, but also inspired my own book, The Journey to the West by the Ming Dynasty writer called Hu Cheng'en. So he wrote this story some 100 years ago about, you know, a real monk in the history with 3 surreal fictional characters, including a monkey, came all the way to India because for Chinese, anything beyond the Himalaya mountain is the West. So they came to the West in order to achieve or acquire the real Buddhist sutras, the Buddhist books, so they could bring back to China to translate in the real good way to introduce to Chinese people. Again, not about journey, it's about cultural translation. And indeed, the real monk, he's a real character. In that book, he brought all the Buddhist sutras back to China. And in real life, he translated all the books again, you know, in his own good knowledge. And for me, I think this is a book which kind of really kind of inspired me, and I hope you have time to read this book. Thank you.